Hey guys, and welcome to some kind of review of King's Quest by Sierra and Activision. Now those are two game companies that we don't really hear much about anymore, but there is a revival plan to bring these companies back into the scene. But the developers of this new King's Quest title is really by The Odd Gentleman. Now, a bit of history into the development of the new King's Quest. Telltale was actually going to make a new King's Quest game, but the rights were recovered by Activision and they had their own plans for it. Now, what is King's Quest in general? Well, the first game being called King's Quest anyway, was released in 1983 and it spanned all the way into the late 90s. So it's been a while, but of course, because it's been so long, it's not really the same people behind it. And it's not really like any of the previous games that were mainly point and click and quite pixely back in the days. So we have to see if this new King's Quest really does stand up to its predecessors. And just to give you my personal history with King's Quest, I didn't really get into many of the King's Quest back in the day because I was too young for most of them, and I never really played through any of them in particular. I played a little bit of some of them, and I definitely watched some of the old King's Quest. But just keep that in mind in terms of my review, that I am looking at the new King's Quest as a standalone title. Now, this King's Quest is a single-player adventure game that's based on the old King's Quest titles, but it's not a prequel or sequel, and it's sort of a reimagining, and it takes place between the storylines of the old games, and specifically, it is not King's Quest 9. The controls of the game aren't really point and click anymore, but it's more of a directional or analog controls, and you could play the game completely one-handed on the keyboard, honestly. But there is some occasional first-person stuff which you could use the mouse for, but it's not really that necessary either. But this new King's Quest game is following the episodic format, and there's going to be 5 different chapters being released over probably the next year. Alright, so here we are in King's Quest on the main menu here, and I just want to show you a few of these things here. So first of all, let's have a look at the settings. I am running the PC version here, and let's have a look at audio and visual. We've got subtitles, a couple separate volume sliders here, which is quite nice, but you might notice that there's music volume and sound effects volume and a main volume, but there's no vocals or dialogue volume, which is really weird why that's not in there, because dialogue is sort of pretty much the main focus of the game. I mean, you could sort of drop music and sound effects individually and leave the main volume as sort of a dialogue volume, but that's still really awkward. It'd be nice to have its own slider there. In terms of visual options, again, it's very, very limited. We got texture quality low, medium, high. It doesn't even indicate what that means. We've got full screen on and off. There's no borderless or windowed mode there. VSync on and off resolutions. Again, this is a little awkward where it's sort of going left and right there, but that's going to be fine. We can cancel those changes. And you can of course use a mouse as well, and you can see it doesn't become a drop-down menu either with the mouse here, so we can press back there. I'm currently using a PlayStation 4 controller in case you're wondering, with input mapper. King's Quest does not automatically detect a PlayStation 4 controller, unlike Rocket League. Anyway, let's have a look at our controls here, and controls is probably the most limited menu in the game. I mean, we've got basically a QWERTY keyboard or an AZERTY keyboard, and that's it. No rebindable keys whatsoever. I mean, I can also go over to using my controller here, and again, it's just the Xbox controller, and you can't rebind anything. And I really don't know why games don't allow you to rebind keys when, you know, I'm pretty sure it's a pretty easy implementation. And if you want to rebind keys, especially in case you're left-handed, you might want to rebind those keys, definitely. In terms of gameplay options, not much there. Controller vibration, mouse sensitivity, that's about it. I mean, you can't really expect much on gameplay options anyway. It's an adventure game. One thing I did notice is there's this achievements menu here, and it doesn't seem like I can do anything with it. I mean, it doesn't actually open anything, so I'm not sure if that's a bug or something there, but there's no achievements for me. That's fine. I'm not too much into achievements anyway. And you can of course have different save slots. So I've been playing on save slot 1, and I can swap over to save slot 2 here and jump into a new game. And I'm gonna just begin a new game here, and it just drops you right into the game. This is the first scene, so all the footage from this review is gonna be from pretty much the first hour of the game. I don't really want to spoil anything, but in terms of controls, you can see analog stick works quite nicely. I can swap over to mouse and keyboard here, and again, I'm just using WASD. You can press tab to open up your inventory. The inventory screen is a little clunky because you can see here there's just slots for items, and it's just displaying 5 at a time, and when there's more than 5 items, you just gotta scroll left and right. And you might see this mouse cursor here that I'm using, and honestly, it doesn't get much use. Most of the game can just be controlled with WASD. The spacebar key sort of interacts, and then we've got tab to open up inventory. You might be wondering, where's all the other UI and menu items? Well, there really aren't any. There's no map, there's no journal, which can be quite confusing at times. And, well, that's sort of a detriment to the game, where you can see a spacebar sort of allows you to interact with items. Like, rebindable keys would be nice here. I usually prefer E to be my interactable key, but, well, they decided to set it as spacebar. But yes, the actual world that you can explore can be quite large, and a map would definitely be useful. Especially there's times where certain characters would say, oh, head north and then head east. And there's really, like, just look at the screen right now. Is there any indication which way is north and which way is east? I mean, you could assume up is north, but the screen often seems to point at you in different angles and different directions, so there's no real indication as to which way is north and east. So let me just show you one more interactable thing here. I'm using the controller here, and of course you can see there are a number of quick time events and things like this, and usually quick time events, people don't like them in action games, but I think in adventure games we can see from Telltale titles that quick time events do have their place, and not their place is not everywhere, but I think in King's Quest, they use QuickTime events quite nicely. Also, I was mentioning there's no journal either, and you can see on the controller in the lower right corner, we can bring up inventory in similar ways. But there's no journal, so oftentimes if you talk to a bunch of characters and maybe you quit the game and come back later and forget what you were doing at the time, well, the only way to find out what you were actually doing is to go back and talk to those characters. So it can be quite disorientating in terms of what's going on at what point. A journal would be really, really nice. Not saying they should have a quest compass or any kind of directional arrows or quest list or anything like that, but maybe a journal log or something like that. But you can hear some of the voice acting here and some of the wonderful music. And yes, the game does have a great way of setting the mood and setting the aesthetic like this, so it's really quite nice. So the narrative of this game is told from the perspective of the protagonist, Graham, as an old king, and he's telling his granddaughter stories, kind of in a How I Met Your Mother style, where he mentions a few things and you see it play out, and if you make a mistake in-game, it sort of goes to this screen where it's showing the Graham telling his granddaughter, oh, that's what would have happened if I made the wrong choice. And then you can go back and sort of redo that scene. Right off the bat, you can see the visuals themselves are charming, though somewhat lacking at times. There's a lot of clipping of 3D objects, and there's a few things that do look a little bit off, and it could look a little bit better, but this is an adventure game, so we're not going to focus too much on the graphics and visuals, though the actual aesthetic, the direction they went with the visuals, I think is a really nice, charming, cartoony but not condescending direction. But where the game really does stand out is the voice acting. The voice acting is astoundingly good, and the writing is humorous, interesting, and witty throughout the experience, which is very, very important because there is a ton of dialogue. In terms of just hearing people talk to each other or you in dialogue conversations, there's a lot of it. So just as a sample, here's a couple of clips of dialogue from the game.
Yeah. King Edward was so proud that you returned his lost treasure that he made you king. Everyone knows that part.
What's wrong with your foot? Probably stepped on a spiniferous thornweed. Don't worry, I got just the fix for that.
Treasure in hand, I escaped and adventured onward.
Oh, how delightful. And you escaped with all the treasure?
Yes.
And to back up the vocals, we've got a soundtrack that has numerous songs. Pretty much every scene has its own unique song, and they're well written and well composed, and it sounds fantastic, and it really does enhance the scenes. The game is pretty much a puzzle game, but the puzzles are pretty straightforward, and I did get stuck here and there, but for the most part you can solve puzzles within a couple minutes at most, and if you get stuck it's probably going to be for like 10-15 minutes tops, just because you didn't put 2 and 2 together in some way. But paying attention to visual clues will help a lot in solving puzzles. So if you're just sort of paying attention and noticing the things going on in the environment, it really doesn't show you things that aren't relevant. Pretty much everything on screen that you will see or that it focuses on will be relevant to some sort of puzzle, or it'll be some sort of clue that you'll be able to use in the future. Now, when you are solving these puzzles, it is possible to fail and die, but you don't have to worry too much because these sudden death situations will feel really, really unfair, but it's got immediate restart. So if you die or you walk into a situation where you can't come out of and it kills you, well, it just sort of restarts you from that scene immediately. So there's no downtime and no waiting to sort of respawn or anything like that. And this sort of harkens back to the old King's Quest where you could die in really unfair ways and you had to restart like way back from your last save. But overall, the focus is more on the narrative and storytelling aspects of the game. And as far as I can tell from this first chapter, the storytelling and what it's focusing on is really interesting and it's really unique, and it does provide new perspectives and a whole new way to get to know the King's Quest series. Oh, but I do have to note, in the puzzles, a lot of them that can be somewhat difficult. If you fail more than a few times, well, the game often screams out more direct instructions, like it'll actually tell you exactly what you need to do. And in some puzzles, it does actually offer an easy mode option where if you're having real difficulty getting past some parts, there's often a shortcut or some kind of easier way to get around it, but it does sort of make you feel bad for doing so. I'm not going to spoil it too much, but you'll see what I mean when you get to those situations if you happen to be failing a lot at certain puzzles. Now, some things that are a little awkward with the game is there is a lot of backtracking in a lot of the scenes. Like you have to walk over to a scene, you discover a clue, and then you got to walk all the way back. And if you don't know exactly what's going with what, because a lot of these puzzles are sort of lock and key puzzles where you have to find an object and then basically combine it with something else, or use A on B to get C, then if you don't know exactly what's going with what, you might be walking back and forth in a lot of these scenes. And although the scenery is very nice to look at, it can get a little tiring walking here and there. But there are numerous occasions where it does give you a shortcut. And there are even times where you dread walking back a certain distance and it'll just give you some sort of shortcut so you don't have to do it. So it does actually manage to cut out quite a bit of those boring walking scenes where you're just trying to get from A to B. But one thing that can get a little bit tiring and annoying at times is that, as far as I could tell, there was no way for me to skip any of the dialogues or cutscenes. I tried every button, and basically when someone was talking or when there was a certain cutscene, you couldn't skip it. And you might wonder why you want to skip it. Well, there are certain puzzles or scenarios where you can fail, and if you fail, you have to sort of repeat that scene. And when it repeats the scene, then you got to go through the same dialogue again. So there are a lot of times when I wanted to skip the dialogue because I've already heard it, but I wasn't able to. And just in general, in terms of a few refinements, I did notice a couple bugs where I walked in and the dialogue was cut off, and there were a couple graphical glitches, but nothing major. The game overall, in terms of polish, there's no major bugs or issues with playing the game. Now, so far in the game, it has presented me with some big choices, and it implies that they will have big consequences in the future. But at this current phase, in chapter 1, we don't really know what consequences those are gonna have. And that's sort of a nice feeling where you know they're big decisions, but you don't know exactly how it's gonna play out in the future. And I'm sure these choices will come back to haunt you or reward you in future chapters. So one of the big questions of the new King's Quest is, do you need to play any of the old King's Quest games to enjoy this one? Now, the game does have multiple references to the old games, from random tapestries to some meta dialogue where it's sort of referencing certain situations in the old games, but it's nothing too major, and you can sort of get that that's sort of an in-joke, and you can appreciate it as an in-joke even if you don't get it. But you don't have to play the originals at all. I myself have only played a bit of a couple of them, and I've watched some of the old King's Quests. But I really do feel that this new King's Quest is an entirely new experience, and it's great as a standalone title by itself. And from what I can tell, this new King's Quest is setting up for some really big emotional hits in the future. And the granddaughter, well, because you're sort of playing as Graham, who's already an old king, and you're reminiscing on these old stories from his past adventures, I can see King's Quest moving forward with the granddaughter, actually. The granddaughter is sort of this adventurous young girl who wants to go out and make her own stories, and you could really see her as a future protagonist, but probably not in this series of King's Quest, but perhaps in a future title. Anyway, you can buy the first chapter on Steam right now, or you can buy the complete collection. You can also buy the first chapter, and then there's a season pass DLC that will add on chapter 2 to 5, and there's not much price difference either way. So you can definitely test out the first chapter if you like, or watch the multiple Let's Plays that are on YouTube already and see if you want to get into it yourself. And if you're wondering how many hours it's going to take to beat this game, well, it took me somewhere between 4 to 5 hours to complete chapter 1. So we could assume that all the chapters are going to be about that long. So in summary, King's Quest, I'm gonna say, is a light-hearted adventure game where, although you could criticize some of its mechanical flaws, in the end, I think people are gonna take away the experience, the magical, fantastical experience that is King's Quest. Alright, so that wraps up some kind of review of King's Quest. Hope you found the video useful, but remember, a review is a single perspective on a game, and in the end, you have to make up your own decision on whether you like the title or not. Alright, that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.